kind of keep us on schedule today. I invited Moroni Benali and Restoring Ancestral Winds here to talk to us today because I felt like it, A, is a very important topic anyway, but it fit very well in with our previous presenter, Melinda. And I think Moroni will talk to us a lot about the bill that was passed and kind of where its status is, and as advocates, how we can do more. So I will turn the time over to Moroni and let him start his presentation.
Thank you, Rochelle. Also, my name is Moroni Benali. I'm presenting to you from the Navajo Nation, middle of nowhere. I'm about 30 miles south of Bluff on the Arizona side, the Navajo. So normally what we do in Navajo is we tend to introduce ourselves to establish relationships and relationality. And so na shashanish lido but ani bashish chindo to hana edashachedo tabaha edashanella daisakut aldenenshle. So we do this as a way to acknowledge all the existing relationships that we encounter, and to be sure that we are always remembering that the structure of that relationship within the introduction is the essence of who we are as people, and that's sort of this Navajo way of introducing ourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the task force. I'll give you a lot of the technical details of the task force, but before that, I'm going to really get into sort of the history and why attention has been given to this particular topic. I'm going to turn off my video because I'm pinging you from middle of nowhere and the broadband isn't that broad. So if I turn off my video, I can share with you better. So the task force, before we do that, I've been with Restoring Ancestral Winds for about almost 5 years now. And we are one of 19 tribal coalitions across the country that works on eliminating violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, the work that we do within the tribes and Indian country. And Restoring Ancestral Winds serves the Great Basin area, and we work with the number of tribes in there. But specifically in Utah, we work with the 9 federally recognized tribes in the state of Utah. And we're primarily funded out of the U.S. Department of Justice in their Office of Violence Against Women, and we've got funding from other sources as well through the state of Utah and some foundations. This is not new. We see this a lot, right? We see this, and this is from a couple of years ago, and I did a snapshot this morning, and we see images of missing people in the news. We see it on social media. We hear people talk about it. It's everywhere, and what we're finding is that Indigenous people, not just women now, but Indigenous people, both men, women, girls, boys, and the whole spectrum, are going missing or become victims of homicide at incredibly disproportionate rates, and this was happening for a while. The movement of murdered missing Indigenous women actually started out of Canada, and the name popped up in the mid-2000s. And what they were doing was that they called it, I think it was the Highway of Death in British Columbia. And what they found in Canada was that particular road, rural road, is where a number of First Nations women went missing. And nothing was being done about it. The First Nations had met with Canadian officials, and still no movement happened. And so they put all their energy into starting a grassroots activist movement to give voice to this issue. And so it started spreading very slowly across First Nations in Canada. and picked up with the tribes in the US because we found similar patterns of victimization around individuals going missing and becoming victims of homicide. And so there wasn't a lot of attention paid except among the activists and those tribal coalitions like ourselves that work within this area. And it started to gain some momentum when, it gained incredible momentum in 2018. So in 2018, the Urban Indian Health Institute out of Seattle released a report surveying 71 cities across the country and 38 states, and they selected those on the proportion of Native people living within those states. And so these were 38 states that had the highest representation of Indigenous communities in those states. And so what they found was they had placed Salt Lake City, I think, at number 8, and the state itself at number 9 out of those cities and states that they surveyed, and placed Salt Lake City in Utah within the top 10 for having the highest rates of murdered missing Indigenous women. And so Restoring Ancestral Winds began working with local communities, local Native communities, organizations, and we reached out to law enforcement, and we all have our stories of working with law enforcement, and oftentimes we're the ones pulling the wagon with them in it. Other times they are the ones that enable us to see clearly, more clearly, what is going on. And so there's this sort of wonderful synergy back and forth between law enforcement and those of us that work in this field. And so we began working with them, and obviously we had some disagreements about how the study was designed, methodology, and that sort. But the concern remained, and we didn't know if the state of Utah and Salt Lake City, if that data was represented accurately, and whether or not there actually was a real crisis in the state of Utah. And so Restoring Ancestral Winds, myself and Yolanda, we started working with Representative Romero and doing work and research on this epidemic, trying to understand its contours, its structure, trying to understand its victims, how individuals are victimized, trying to basically just understand what was happening in this crisis we didn't know. And we had plenty of anecdotal evidence from different sources, but we didn't know how to make this formal and it, in a way that would lead to some sort of legislative change, or at least lead to some sort of legislative intervention. And so we met with Representative Romero, and we had, and her wisdom was just a godsend and absolutely amazing. And so, And so we met with Representative Romero, and that year, following her guidance and wisdom, we decided that we wanted to petition the state of Utah to just establish a MMIWG Awareness Day, in part because we were, like many other states across the country, we're running into issues that where the issue was and it's really like a tautological, like circular problem, is we would say to law enforcement, there isn't adequate data, but we see this is happening. And their response to us was, the data tells us that this is not happening, right? And so we were sort of in this cycle with them, and we didn't quite know what to do. And so we tried to we started working with members of the legislature, and they too were like, well, where's the data? And we're like, well, we don't have the data. And they're like, why don't you have the data? I'm like, because no one wants to really fund or prioritize Indigenous issues. So we're sort of SOL. And so at that time in 2018 or 2019, we weren't able to establish a task force, which was what we wanted, but we followed Representative Romero's guidance, and we had then established MMIG Awareness Day, which in itself was incredibly difficult to get passed. It was just a concurrent resolution. That's all it was. And it was incredibly hard to pass, but we finally did. It wasn't unanimous, but we had hoped it was. That's what we were hoping, but it wasn't. And so that year, we then started working to really build up the reasoning behind why a task force was needed. And we started looking at many different sources as much as we could. And we're going to go through a lot of what we found. That's sort of like we were trying to triangulate, quadrulate, or whatever you want to say, pinpoint as many different indicators of what we think this was to point at it. And so that's what we did in 2020 to say, here's what we can find from existing data sources that suggest that this is happening. And so we went 2020 with Representative Romero, and we had the task force. And that too was very difficult because we had to be very careful about how we talked about this epidemic as it occurs around natural resource development and infrastructure, especially those that are doing essentially these man camps. And that became an issue at the legislature, and we had to then essentially rewrite the entire bill to be very sensitive to the natural resource interests by the state itself and not to implicate them. And what we had told them was, we're not implicating the industry itself. What we're trying to get at is understand is, why are these men in these man camps doing this to our women? It's not. And so we had to have a very nuanced conversation with them. And eventually we got the task force passed, but with no funding. And so with no funding. And so 2020, we then started working, and that's when the pandemic happened. And we couldn't start the work on the task force. And we did as much as we could online, but as we all know, many of the tribes were so, their attention was focused on their own communities and just fighting the fatal consequences of COVID-19 within tribal communities. And so we weren't able to do much in 2020, but we did establish the task force. Representatives from the state and tribes came to this task force, but because we had no money, we couldn't quite do anything. And so the next year, 2020, we then started really working on to justify again why we needed funding for this task force to do a specific study. And again, we were met with that. It's like, why do you need this? You're already telling us this is an issue, and the data doesn't exist in law enforcement. And we started going back and forth again. It's like, the problem, here's a problem, the data doesn't exist, but we know it's a problem from all these sources. And then legislature says, well, where's the data to back this up? And we're like, the problem is there is no data. And they're like, well, we can't do anything if we can't, if there's no data. And so we were going again, back and forth, but eventually the task force and the funding requirement that we were asking was met. And so 2021, we got the task force established and funded, and we just got the task force clause extended, and we had no funding yet again, if I recall. And so earlier this year, in 2022, we finally got the funding. And hired Wilder Research Institute out of Minnesota. And Wilder is a partly Indigenous Research Institute, and they conducted this incredibly comprehensive report for the state of Minnesota and for Minnesota's state task force, MMIW task force. And so the state of Utah has contracted them the task force, and their work is beginning. And so this is the HB 41 that established the task force. And then last year we got the task force this year we got the task force funded. And so within this, we can see that the task force was conducted to do appropriate consultations with tribes, and so I'm not going to go through all of this, but part of what the task force is trying to do is, through all of these specific objectives, is to get a better sense of what is the root cause of this for two populations. One, for just the legal policy structure of the state of Utah, like what is happening within that framework that enables or allows this type of violence to happen. So we're looking for concerns with legislative processes, rules, regulations, protocol, all of that, and trying to find what are the gaps within that enable and sustain this crisis. And the second is looking at the root cause for tribes. It's just, and for the tribes, it's not just to stop the bleeding, but it's to look for the underlying cause. And so for tribes, what they're wanting to get out of this is a sense of healing for their communities. So many tribes see the task force not only as a legislative mechanism, but they also see it as a forum that enables and allows them to mourn, to address and touch the pain of not only themselves, but their communities and their nations. And so the task force has been laden with far more symbolic value than just simply a legislative blue ribbon committee or commission. And so this is what we're doing right now within the task force, and the tribes are all a part of working with this task force. And we have we're very excited about Wilder and what they will be doing in the next year and a half, and we look forward to that report. And so this is where we are. But I wanted to get into a lot of the meat of why this is important, and take a look at this crisis. But I wanted to take it, sort of approach it from how the tribes view this, because that's important. In part because what I said is that the tribes have sort of placed symbolic healing value onto the task force and any work around this area, where a lot of us, or where the others may sort of generalize it as, oh, we're just solving a crime and putting an end to this and moving on, maintaining law and order. And so those are sort of two different ways of approaching this. And so I want to get into how the tribes see this and why in the future they may continue to say, despite the task force, they may continue to say, you've missed certain things. You didn't pay enough attention to this. And so that's what I want to get at. And it's important for all of us doing the work as well, is because we want to make sure that justice is served, but the type of justice that makes them feel whole. And oftentimes the legal justice where many of our work tends to end is not adequate nor satisfactory. And I'll explain why. So why is this happening, right? We don't really know, but we have plenty of indicators, and we're hoping that this task force will help us understand, or this research firm will help us understand that. So we start here, and the reason why we start here is we have to have at least, and the reason we start here is because when we're having conversations with tribes reference a notion of personhood or self that may not be fully represented or reflected in the personal pronouns that we use, like I. I know this is really deep, and I apologize, but I am finishing my PhD, and so I'm one of those. But it's important because this is where we begin to understand what's missing in the application of policy, in the application of law, in the implementation of different programs around domestic violence, around intimate partner violence, around all the different types of violence that we work with. And so why this is important is that it's important then to understand that oftentimes when an Indigenous person is speaking, they are tacitly reflecting those different parts of who they are. That at least in Navajo, they say that the creators endowed Navajos with a way of thinking, of cognitive abilities, of consciousness. They gave them a body for them to feel and do and to work and to do all of these things with this body. And they gave relations, family. And the interesting thing is that the word for mind, I know it's here, but it's also the Navajo word for mind also means family. It's a synonym. And so the creators then placed into each Navajo being a set of relations and said, these will also give you life. And then they put them into a home, their home place, and said, this home is a place of refuge for you to feel protected and grounded, and for you then to feel connected to the universe as a whole. And so when Indigenous people talk about crime, when someone goes missing, we begin to sort of see the strands they're pulling when someone goes missing in their communities. Whereas when we compare this to our Western brothers and sisters who, through no fault of their own, sort of adopted this Enlightenment ideal that separates the mind, the body from the world, and says that they're all not together. The only thing that exists is sort of this, what they call this Cartesian dualism of the mind and body. And then a lot of the programs that we create come out of this. A lot of technological advances have come out of this construct. And so what I'm saying is that as we move forward, we have an understanding of what this means to Indigenous people, so that we have a better sense of the tools that were created in this frame, why Indigenous people say it's not fully addressing their concerns. And so that is the foundation. And then we begin to see it gets even more complicated, right? Of the different types of relations and how they work, the structure of those. And so when someone goes missing or is harmed, it harms one of these and certainly impacts the community and the nation as a whole. And this is the thing about relationality is we talk about relationality in Indigenous communities. And Martin Brokenleg is a Lakota scholar, and he says the literal translation of this word in Lakota is "my relatives, you all are." In other words, all my relations. And so what he's saying is that I stand in relation with everyone, both human, non-human, living things, even inanimate objects have a living force in them. And that living force is a part of who I am and a part of this entire world. And so this is how these Indigenous people sort of construct their world. And so when they say all are related, they literally mean that there is a unseen sort of force, element, or connection that binds people together. And Navajo scholar Herbert Benally says relations restored holds the same meaning as indestructible happiness restored. So in other words, relations, when someone comes back who is missing, all the other relations are impacted and restored. Whereas when we take a look at this Western approach of just the mind and body, this sentiment may not necessarily hold because elements may be missing to have this sentiment hold. And so this is sort of what is operating underneath a lot of these Indigenous understanding of how the world works. Even if they don't speak the language, they've been brought up in this context. And so they recognize this even if they can't name or explain why. And so what happened? Colonization came and brought trauma of all kinds. And many of these relations were disrupted or reformulated. Um, and so what ends up happening is we oftentimes have a system, as I said before, that will just focus on one aspect of Navajo or indigenous understanding of self. And so we'll have a tendency then of a lot of our good partners, non-indigenous partners, our good white brothers and sisters, all these others come and do all this incredible work. But then the outcome tends to be like, oh, it didn't address our concerns. And oftentimes we're a bit confused, like, why? And this is part of the reason why, is that a lot of indigenous communities may not know these specific terms, but they feel them. And what I'm trying to do is give some name what they're feeling in using at least this indigenous way of seeing the world, this indigenous philosophy of who they are as self. When they say the first person pronoun I, they're invoking all of these. And so when programs are focused on just one aspect of this, they feel that sense of loss of their personhood on these other parts. And as we'll begin to see, that this sort of sets the stage for risky behaviors and all sorts of other things that are related to MMIW. And so what we, as I was saying, as we see, there are pathways to going murdered and missing. And what we find is these initial connections that were disrupted. For example, many tribes, their legal claim to land is incredibly complicated, such that it hinders their ability for economic growth to create jobs. And so there's poverty. And as we all know, that these are ongoing parts of structural violence that can lead to complex trauma of different types, that can lead to elevated risk factors. And so what we're seeing then is that tribes through colonization had a lot of exposure and to different types of trauma. And there's these lingering, and this morning we talked about these epigenetic factors. And that's one of the strains that sort of like threads the entire colonial experience of indigenous communities together. Is there's still a lot of this trauma that exists within community. There's distrust of structures, not just people, but structures. There's distrusts of all sorts of different things, that different structures and policies and rules and curriculum. And so this distrust continues. And what we find even today is there's high rates of, so there's just all different types of things that happen to them through, so there's a psychologist out of Harvard. His name is Joseph Gone, Gone, and he is doing a lot of the most contemporary latest research on what he calls indigenous historical trauma. And he makes that distinction because there is something peculiar, he says, about the historical trauma that indigenous people experience, in part because of their relationship to land and the embodiment of relations within their own person. And so tying those strands together, and so we see that there's this impact of colonization happen, and it elevated all sorts of risk factors, and as we know, that these tend to lead into all sorts of different things. And so there are different patterns that people go through, and oftentimes these may happen. They may be sort of embedded within each other, and so there's all sorts of different ways that this can happen. And colonization is one part of that explanation. And so we take a look at indigenous notions of trauma, right? And so we start with this notions of balance and harm. And so most indigenous communities will have some sense of organizing their universe based on these on the four directions, and within those four directions, they'll place different types of knowledge that they connect with those directions. And so, and the idea is that these different parts, when they are balanced through some set of through trade-offs and different synergies, when that is balanced, when you balance these, you're then in a state of beauty, of harmony, of happiness. But when someone violates one of those aspects of who you are, it's a violation of relationality. It's a violation of that balance that imbues life with life, really. And so for example, when we harm someone, it emphasizes the non-reverence or the disrespect for life and all creation. And so that is how Indigenous people tend to see violence, as they frame it as balance, as harm and imbalance. And so when someone does something to me, it impacts me, and the trauma then disrupts my relationship with myself. It disrupts my relationship with my body. It disrupts my relationship with others. And so there's a harm, they say. And so this violation disrupts these worlds, disrupts relations. And so, at least in Navajo, how this happens, this concept of trauma, in every person, at least according to creation stories, there exists within what they call the wheat, that thing which stands within, or the indwelling. And that, and according to Navajo thought, is when that is in balance with your body, this indwelling, when it's in balance with your body, then you're fully in balance across those 4 dimensions. But when trauma disrupts something, so let's say, for example, when I was ages 3 to 5, I was sexually abused. And coming to find out a lot to work with my therapist and others, that impacted the way that I saw myself and impacted the relationship I had with my parents. I'm just barely beginning to sort of have a relationship I probably should have had with my parents had I not been abused. And so we see, like, there are all these things, and we know this, right? We know how this all works. And so one of the things that we find, at least in Navajo, is that the trauma violates that indwelling, that thing that is supposed to enable you to have internal balance. And so when that's violated, it creates disruptions and waves and ripples across all those 4 areas. And so as a result of that, Navajos have a number of ceremonies addressing different types of harms and violations, from issues relating to addiction, which is really interesting if we get to that, because that addiction element, the ceremony, is meant to bring that person all the way back into an authentic state of being. And that's how they address these addiction and a lot of these other things as well. And so these ceremonies are meant then to restore the balance of that person for being harmed. And so when someone goes missing, how do you restore that if that relationship is a part of what constitutes you as you? And so there's a part of you that will be always missing, and there are ceremonies and prayers that can help restore that. But to understand how this trauma works, this is what we're talking about. And again, here's this complex graphic, but all this graphics is saying is that each part, so relationality is composed of these 4 elements. That is the structure of relationality, is that we relate with our thinking to their entire being. We relate with our body in appropriate, respectful ways with theirs. And that's how this works. And so when we have a disruption in one of those, we have an incomplete relational experience with others. And again, so what we see here is elevated risks. We see disruptions of relations that happen as a result of these risk factors that then lead to a number of these, which then ends up with one going murdered or becoming missing. So what are the national trends, right? This is the survey from 2010, 2012. This is a state report, but this survey data gets sort of recirculated, and I'm hoping they update it, because right now this is the data that was used again in the NIJ 2016 official report. And then again, those numbers are again circulated again in a lot of the MMIW task force, both at the state and federal level. So I'm hoping at some point they update this research. And so what we're seeing here, right, is that what this report stated and found in 2010, 2012 is that both Native men and women have elevated prevalence estimates compared to everyone else over all of these different areas. And so when we see this type of violence happening, we know something's happening. We know that something's wrong, but when we see these elevated rates, we're like, well, what is happening? Why is this happening? And where is it happening? And why is this not happening to other races? And we're still trying to figure that out. And so quick overview of violence in Indian country. I'm going to go through this 5 or 10 slides very fast, just because I want to spend a bit more time on some other things. So overview of Indian country, I'm not going to go through all of this, but we see high rates of violence across both men and women. And a lot of this are pathways to one going missing. And we know a lot of the indicators of the different types of violence that indicate that increases the probability that one will be a victim of homicide in the next interaction. And so we see that there are very high rates of violence. Physical violence, 55.5% of women and 43% of men have experienced some sort of physical violence from their intimate partner. That is crazy, but it is consonant with my experience growing up and with my experience today. And again, we see the different types, different categories of violence and what they did and the different rates. When we look at the indigiqueer two-spirit community, we even see elevated rates with them. And this is based on as much of the data that we could find. And unfortunately, these are the latest that we can find about queer Indigenous people and the rates of attack. And so we take a look at sexual violence again, and we see these again, very high rates of violence across both male and female. And again, high rates with our two-spirit community. And this is just as much as we can. Obviously, we all would love more data across all the different fields that we're working in. And it would be fantastic to have this be included in that, to have more data on this. And we're hoping that this task force will help us understand these rates within the state of Utah as well. And so we look at stalking, elevated rates there as well. And we take a look at these different types of violence again, how this is happening, how they stalk each other. And it's eye-opening, sobering statistics again. 24% of those that identify as queer or two-spirit in the Navajo Nation, 24% were followed or chased within the last 6 months. It's like 1 in 4. Those are some sobering numbers. And we look at the psychological aggression and what is happening within that. But when we take a look at all of this, one of the things that we have to take a look at when it comes to the murdered missing Indigenous is we have to take a look at this, the interracial of what is happening, who are the perpetrators. And we're finding that there a lot of that is coming from our non-Native brothers and sisters. We take a look at what's happening within our two-spirit folks and what's happening with psychological aggression and their rates of bullying, intimidation. In other words, what we're seeing across all of this is that Indigenous people in relation to domestic violence, sexual violence, are not doing very well. And there are a lot of structural factors around that, and we'll get into some of that, and hoping that that's what the task force will continue to investigate. So what about Utah, right? so we looked across the country, but what about Utah? So there's 3.5 million. There's about 50,000 Native folks in Utah. So this is the breakdown of the population. So I just want to break this down so we can really take a look at what the disproportionate violence. So this is a homicide rate, and this is constructed from the Department of Health, from their database. And what we're finding is that this bottom number shows the percent population in the state of Utah. Our white brothers and sisters have a rate of what, 2? And so our black brothers, and so in other words, what we're seeing is our black brothers and sisters are being victims of homicide at twice the rate of our white brothers and sisters. But look at indigenous communities. We're just over 8, which means that indigenous people are victims of homicide at a rate 4 times our white brothers and sisters in the state of Utah. And so we see all of these indicators again, right? Like, what is happening, and why is this number so large? And so we take a look at all of these different factors, and it then gets filtered through layers of jurisdiction: federal, state, tribal jurisdiction, county sheriffs not wanting to enter tribes for fear of violating some constitutional tribal right over sovereignty. And there's all sorts of things layered around jurisdiction. There's issues with data collection. And so one of the things that we're even talking about, right, is the first thing is like, no one, so oftentimes, and I'm sure we've done it, I've done it, when we just don't have enough data around our Native people, we put an asterisk and say not enough data, and then we leave them out of the analysis and try to triangulate the Native experience. And so we had the same thing, data collection. Other issues with law enforcement protocol of not consistently asking for race or not knowing how to ask for race. And so there's issues with that. There's media inattention. Just recently, again, there are those there was that white teacher in the South who went missing, and plenty of national attention. And in that period, we had 10, 15 of our Native women go missing, and not a word from national media. And so there's a lot of media inattention. The same thing with Deseret News, Salt Lake Tribune. A lot of the publications in Salt Lake City often do not bring attention to this either. Again, there's jurisdiction. And then there's just sort of cultural silence. It's like, oh, the tribes and indigenous people are so few in number that we rarely see them. So out of sight, out of mind. And I'm not trying to attach any nefarious intentions, but that's just sort of how society has operated. And so a lot of that then, so we have these things that happen as a result of all the violence. It then gets sort of filtered through these things and a number of others. And then all the gaps and failures on the policy failures and regulatory failures, whatever, then ends up in one going missing or murdered. And because this is happening, no attention is further paid to it, and the crisis continues. And so we take a look at the perpetrators, right? And we see who the perpetrators are and what's happening. And this is a troubling situation, but it holds, right? So, for example, in the U.S., tribal officers cannot arrest or charge any non-Native person, except for a few exceptions in Indian country for any crime. And so, essentially, what you had until last year was an entire reservation as sort of a black box outside of the reach of the arm of the law for a lot of non-Native people. So then what we find is we found a lot of perpetrators that tend to commit those specific crimes of homicide, assault on tribal land, knowing that they will most likely not be charged because they can't be charged by tribal police officers. And so the Supreme Court attempted to make a fix by saying, well, the tribe still can't do anything, but they can at least detain the person temporarily until a state, municipal, or county police officer can come and address that situation. And so even this, you can see that this is a huge loophole for the types of crimes that a lot of these non-native perpetrators perpetrate on our communities. And so then we also have the Tribal Law and Order Act that the US passed. And what this is trying to do is this law is trying to, one, expand the authorities of tribes so that they actually can prosecute and charge non-native people for committing crimes on their reservations. Two, it's really trying to find ways to share data and create collaborative jurisdictional schemes or frameworks between tribes, states, and others, so that individuals are not left out. And so, for example, if you know the state of Utah, if a crime happens in Navajo Mountain, which is one of the near the border, southern border of Utah, on the Navajo Nation, if a crime happens there, both tribal, state, and federal police, if a crime happens and someone calls, it will take up to 6 hours before the first response. And if that responder is a tribal police officer, they can only temporarily hold until, and to complicate that, they can only hold them until the next urgent matter that they have to deal with, because in the Navajo Nation, there's like one cop for every 1,000 people. Where law enforcement is stretched thin. And so there's all sorts of practical problems around this. And so that Tribal Law and Order Act was one of those attempts to try to fix that jurisdiction issue. And the task force itself is trying to work on trying to figure out these jurisdictional issues as it relates to prosecution, but also to court orders, especially tribal court orders, and how oftentimes law enforcement that aren't tribal tend not to respect tribal court orders because they don't recognize the jurisdiction. And so these are some of the things that we're hoping that the task force will work on. And so I've talked about this, so I'm not going to spend time sort of repeating that, but a lot of that is just sharing information. And so here's a quick thing, right? Are we in Indian country? To understand this jurisdiction part. So if you're not in Indian country, there's no tribal commissioner jurisdiction, there's no federal criminal jurisdiction, unless some crime of general applicability applies. And these are oftentimes just federal laws. In Indian country, there might be all of these operating. So the state of Oklahoma right now is going through sort of a restructuring of their entire system because of, turns out the Oklahoma City is actually on tribal land, subject to tribal law and tribal law enforcement. And so it took the Supreme Court to try to work that out and the jurisdiction. And so we're sort of hoping that our experts on the MMIW task force can do the same with far less resources in the Supreme Court, but that is our hope. And so in asking sort of this question, always 4 questions to ask in this order, like where did the crime occur? Who is the suspect? Who is the victim? And what did they do? And when we ask about major crimes, in 1887, again, during colonization, right, of legally tying the arms of tribal law and order behind their backs and expecting us to continue to do it. And so 1887, the United States Congress decided that tribes were not grown up enough to handle crimes in their own communities. So they created the Major Crimes Act in 1887. And those major crimes include homicide, like grand theft and larceny, things like that. And so the tribes cannot do that. These will be done by the federal government. And this holds to this day. And so if a murder, if a perpetrator comes in to the reservation and commits murder, commits homicide, the tribal police can only temporarily hold him, subject to all the other threads that are pulling on their time. And so very easily opens the door for this type of loophole to be abused by perpetrators who have some sort of fetish for Indigenous people or women in particular. And so here's the Major Crimes Act, a list of offenses that tribes do not have authority over. Recently, they're slowly giving back some around sexual abuse and incest, but not much. Again, here's just a simple 4-part graphic about the same thing. So you have a better sense of who's the victim, who's not, and how this all works. And so this is part just to complicate your understanding of jurisdiction, because I don't think anyone really knows. So it's very complicated, it's all the same. Again, if all of those factors around just the historical approach that law enforcement has taken to Indian country, it's not been a stellar record, and so their good investigation for Indian country might not be a good investigation for Salt Lake City. And so we hope that the task force can help enhance and broaden the investigatory capacity and skills of law enforcement in Utah as well. And so part of that is what we're hoping is that it might look something like this for tribes. I'm not going to go all the way through this. Most of you have some understanding of this process. And so part of some of the challenges with that law enforcement may face with the MMIW cases is that there's just these coordination challenges with these multi-jurisdictional cases, distrust of law enforcement, there's reluctance of victims. And we see that everywhere. I myself was a victim, and took me 30 years to actually just say something about it. And so there's a lot going on. There's lack of corroboration. There's a whole issue about chain of custody of evidence and corroboration at each phase. And so there's all sorts of other things happening. And not even to lay on top of that, the methodology that only addresses the mind and body, but not the relations and their sense of home. So when you actually get the data, you're only measuring half of the harm that has been inflicted on the person. And so we see rates of problems with data errors. And so about 3 years ago, the U.S. Department, this was under the Trump administration, the Department of Interior at that time commissioned the Murder Accountability Project to take a look at the state of Utah and in terms of murder rates of reporting. And so what we found is that only 50% of the homicides in the state of Utah were reported to authorities, compared to over 90% for our Black brothers and sisters, nearly 90% for our white brothers and sisters, about 75% for our Asian and Pacific Island brothers and sisters. But we look, 1 in 2 homicides are not reported to authorities. That's what the report found, and what they also found specifically, where it was that only for Native Americans across the whole state, 61.5% were reported, which means that 40% of a lot of homicides were not reported or incorrectly classified, as we're beginning to find out. And there are concerns and issues with coroners as well in incorrectly classifying. And there have been incidences within Salt Lake County about incorrect attaching incorrect causes of death And so this is what this report was doing, was trying to understand the reporting first of homicides, and what they end up finding were a lot of misclassified types of homicide happening within certain counties in the state of Utah. And these are the counties, right? So what we find is that only 21% of the homicides, at least during their data collection phase, 21% of homicides in San Juan County, which is about half Native, only 21% were reported. Where the Utes in UNA County, only 30% were reported. And within this, they're reported in terms of to the CDC, right? And so what they're finding is that a lot of these, again, were reported as accidental overdose, or that there wasn't any suspicious activity, or whatever, however those are often labeled. And so, and our own, in the work that we've been doing with the task force and the listening sessions, these reporting percentages seem to be upheld, at least in the minds of the people, and also in just an empirical reality of their stories. And so what did this implication mean? The implications of not having the data, again, it goes back to that issue we first initially had of, yes, we believe that you think it's a problem, but give us the data, and we tell them there's no data. So they're like, oh, well, it's not really a problem. And so the absence of data, the lack of data. Many of those that go missing may get lost through trafficking. Those that are trafficked have a high probability of being murdered, right? And so a lot of these implications are happening. And so if we then take a look at what are the tribes on their end, what are they hoping to get out of this? And I know we're almost at time. I'll try to get through this quickly. So I'm not going to spend much time on this. I think you have sort of a general understanding of what I'm saying with this, but this is sort of where we begin. Like the tribes are like, this is what we want to get back to. We want to feel at peace and acknowledged by the state of the four parts of ourselves, as we, and because those are important and critical, because this is how we relate to others as well, as this graphic also shows. So in Navajo, they say, Billa ashklai poho ya, meaning that someone with 5 fingers has gone missing. The relative has gone missing. And so what that means then, right? If we take a look at this, that person now is existing in the absence of this. So their world now is incredibly imbalanced. These ripple effects across their body, within their mind, the thoughts of themselves, their thoughts of the loved one who's gone missing, the empty seat at the table, the loss of the laughter, the loss of the extra hands in the garden, the loss of someone who can feel the home with goodness and cheer. So these are the things that Navajos think about, at least Indigenous people think about, when someone goes missing. And if we are talking about that, when this goes missing, it is a harm, it's a violation of balance. And therefore in Navajo, it is a crime. It's not a crime in the Western sense, right? And so our hope then is the task force can find some sort of balance in the work that they're doing to then fully address the parts of being that these Indigenous people and communities hold in order for them to feel whole and to be to feel that peace and balance and in balance with themselves. And so that is the hope of the task force. And we again, like I said, the task force just signed a contract with Wilder, and we are beginning this entire process of trying to find healing while we understand through our journey to understand the root problem of this issue. So thank you so much for listening and your attention. I know this was a lot, and I apologize. I tend to do this I do this for Raw over a series of 5 sessions, but we did it in one, so yay. But thank you so much, and I will leave some time for questions.
Great. I really appreciate you being here. And if anyone has any questions, we have a question in the room. So how long have we had the task force? How long has the task force been in functioning? Was a bad term for, but how long has it been in play?
Yeah, I think I had a slide for that. Let me go all the way back.
I forgot. It started right before the pandemic, but then pandemic, right?
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had the awareness day that we got passed in 2019, and the task force was established in 2020 with no funding. And so we didn't do much with the task force because of the pandemic. And then we got the task force extended and tried to get that funded as well, and that didn't come through, but we got it extended. And then this year, and then this year, earlier this year is when we got fully funded. So it's been operational technically for 3 years, but doing the bulk of the work this last year.
All right, I see Abigail, you have your hand raised. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi Moroni. Every time you speak, I just feel like I'm in the presence of so much wisdom and compassion. So thank you so much for your presentation. You just made a comment that usually you do this in a series of 5 sessions. Is that available to individual programs like Seekhaven, or would you prefer that to be like, I'm just wondering if, okay, awesome. Great, that's so good to hear.
We just did this series with the Urban Indian Center in Salt Lake. Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, cool. Well, I will be in touch about that, and maybe even see if I can broaden it out to some of our community partners as well. That can also benefit from an in-depth presentation from you. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Looks like Shannon, you also have your hand raised. Can you unmute?
Hi, Moroni. That was a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. That's my daughter's picture. I'm not sure. She mutilates my computer every once in a while. So at the last UDVC gathering, there was some conversation about you guys being able to get the LAP without having to have law enforcement present. And I looked at the code, and there's no reason that Native American victim advocates shouldn't be able to do a LAP without law enforcement present. And I'm just wondering if it would be helpful if all of us signed some kind of a letter of support asking for UDVC and the legislature, or whoever we need to ask, for any Native American representing a tribe, or any Native American really, to be able to do a LAP without law enforcement present. That a LAP should be a right of a victim in any circumstance, really, without, if they don't feel safe to have law enforcement there, that a LAP and getting access to a shelter bed should really be a right in this state, especially for someone who doesn't trust law enforcement like a Native American person. And how do you feel about that? Would that be helpful?
I think it would, but I think yes, absolutely, and I think we should maybe before we jump to the a petition, perhaps set a time to meet together and sort of talk about what that would look like. But I do think that would be very beneficial, absolutely, and in part because of just sort of what I talked about today, is that a lot of our community members have a different concept of what constitutes a crime and what constitutes a victimization. And so having that with them would be another fantastic tool for them to talk about with their community.
What I found is a lot of women, until they're safe, don't feel safe to talk to law enforcement.
Oh, absolutely. I agree.
Not until they feel safe, that they feel safe to disclose.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Thank you.
Moroni, there's a question in the chat, and Seneca, I may have said that incorrectly. What is one of the main objectives or tasks that the task force is currently working on?
So right now, the main task of the task force right now is starting a series of interviews with key stakeholders in this entire process. So members of law enforcement, tribal leaders, community leaders, victims. Yeah, so that's the work that we're doing right now in the task force. Well, at the same time, getting reports from tribes as well through the formal meetings. We've been holding listening sessions as well with a number of different communities, and hearing from the community. So so at this point, the task force has sort of summarized a lot of the work that they've done in these listening sessions over the last year and a half. And that is now has become the foundation for the work of Wilder Research Institute as they start working on interviewing specific stakeholders within this crisis. So that's the work that they're doing right now.
Moroni, this is Rochelle. I have a question. So when you talk about police and law enforcement, like one officer per 1,000, and then just a huge geographical area, is there any discussion to get more law enforcement? Would that be helpful?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the projects, at least that RAW is working on right now, is trying to get work with the state of Utah, the Navajo Nation, state of Arizona, New Mexico, and the federal government to find funding to build a law enforcement substation in Montezuma Creek, which would serve the Utah Mountain area or the Utah Navajo area yeah. And so that's part of it. The other part that the tribes and the feds are trying to work on is that the training for a police officer, a tribal police officer, is about 3 or 4 times, maybe, I don't know. It's much longer than a standard training process for other law enforcement, in part because the tribal police officer has to learn 3 sets of laws and 3 sets of codes. And so the process itself is very long and demanding. And so a lot of the police officers tend to drop out. And so that's another just process issue that's related to this entire process as well. And so we're hoping to try to figure out all these different dimensions and tackle the lowest hanging fruit first.
Good. One of the questions in the chat was, are there options for community members or advocates like ourselves to get involved and help?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In all different areas. Absolutely. Just depending on what your area of expertise is or what you want to do. Yeah, certainly accommodate all of those desires.
Any questions in here? What are you doing your dissertation on?
Oh, so my dissertation is actually this. So it's this. So I'm writing my dissertation. So my dissertation is public policy and governance. And so I initially started using game theory to look at how tribes were left out of decision-making process in the public policy process, specifically around like collaboration. And I was looking at co-optation of tribes in that process and trying to map that mathematically. But then, as we all know, trauma pops up in these weird ways. And so near the end of my PhD area is when the childhood trauma started surfacing, and I went on a different tangent. And I'm getting back to the dissertation, but part of it is because I found healing, a lot of healing, going through this particular, trying to apply this particular Navajo wisdom to what I was doing and to my trauma and what was happening with me. And as a result of that, I'm like, you can base an entire policy process off of this and looking at, and there's all these different dimensions of it. And so that's the dissertation now, is like, what would a healing policy process look like? And so that's the dissertation right now, and using data that I've collected from Navajo. So
good. I find that actually very fascinating too, as we talk about how to like collaborate better with different partners, and what do typical meetings look like for different cultures. So it feels like that would be something that could help us as we're looking to start new partnerships with different agencies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And any other questions? Well, Moroni, we really, really appreciate your time and being here, and that is a lot of knowledge. And we hope as the task force goes forward, the SWAVO community is an ally. And if there are things that you need us to send out or call to actions or anything like that, that you please keep us in the loop.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.